Is Qiuyuan free-to-play friendly? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So we are rapidly approaching Qiuyuan's banner, and I myself am very excited about it. However, now we have to start asking the crucial questions about the character, and now we're going to ask, is he free-to-play friendly? And if not, or if so, then why? Well, I'm going to say that obviously, whenever it comes to a second slot teammate, you're naturally going to have to accept that they're going to be on the slightly more niche side compared to DPS in terms of use cases, because after all, the way that teams are structured in this game is that generally speaking, the second slot teammate is a more niche character that's generally able to work with one or two characters really effectively, maybe a little bit more than that. Recently, that hasn't been the case so much, because characters like Qiuyuan and Brant Wuthering Waves have so much damage in their kit that they're even able to play in other teams and see value there. Not only that, but what they provide generally allows them access to be played with multiple different DPSs. So simply being a second slot teammate doesn't automatically mean that a character has to be niche. However, it is pretty normal for that to be the case, and that's how it always was before. Think about characters like Yinlin and Jojo. So I'm not necessarily going to say that he's a worse value pull than some other second slot teammates, simply because he's on the more niche side, because, yeah, he is, but that's just kind of how Wuthering Wave supports are designed. The only truly universal support that we currently have in the game is Shorekeeper and Verena. Otherwise, most of them are always going to be designed like this. So, in what ways can he end up being free-to-play friendly? I think it depends on your investments. Because here's the thing, like anything, he's actually going to end up being a good investment depending on the DPSs that you have on your account. However, that aside, I do actually want to point out an instance where he is actually quite free-to-play friendly. That's if you're a Galbrina main and you don't really have any good teammates for her. The reason I say this is because you have two options with her. You can either run Brant Wuthering Waves and Lupa, or you can just pull for Qiuyuan. And here's the thing, Brant really wants his signature weapon, like he really wants that weapon. Lupa can get by fine on the standard weapon, but either way, that's still 3 gold. Whereas if Qiuyuan, you can likely get away with just him. Yes, having a signature weapon is likely going to be very good, but getting Sig on second slot teammates that don't really focus on damage that much, those aren't really as important as just getting the weapon on your DPS, and Galbrina already doesn't really need her signature weapon all that much because she's really good on static mist and other 5-star weapon options. So, with that in mind, he's actually a pretty low-cost option if you want a good Galbrina team. Not only a good Galbrina team, but our best in slot. As for your final slot, ideally you have Shorekeeper, but if not, then obviously you can just use Verena or whoever else you have. But either way, Shorekeeper's a character that you generally should just have for your account in general, and otherwise, like I said, you just use Verena. So with that in mind, you actually have a pretty realistic way to reduce the amount of cost that you're putting into your Galbrina team. So yeah, he actually does end up being a pretty free-to-play friendly alternative to investing into the full Mono Fusion team, because not only is he the cheapest option, but he's also the most efficient, because he ends up being the strongest option. Now, with that being said, you can use characters like Lupo with basically any fusion character and it's going to be strong, because that woman makes fusion single-handedly one of the most ridiculous attributes there is. She is really good as a character and has a lot of inherent value, so you have to weigh up whether you would rather just have Lupa instead as a general character to have on your account. However, if we're looking at this from a Galbrina main perspective, and you're hypothetically the greatest Galbrina main that has ever lived, you absolutely love the character, she's your everything, well, in that case, you'd rather go for Qiuyuan instead. Even then, that's a bit of an exaggeration. I'd say that if you just play a decent amount of Galbrina, then Qiuyuan's still going to be worth it for you as a cheaper option. So in that sense, he actually does end up being free-to-play friendly when you look at it from that angle, because it's highly likely that you're going to be able to put him on a standard weapon and he's still going to be able to buff for you just fine, because you're able to read his kit in-game right now, not through crossing stars, but through the story trial. So, we already know that his kit is mostly focused on buffing, meaning that while he likely will be able to do damage because Wuthering Waves characters always do some modicum of damage, well, he's definitely more on the supportive side, which means that his own damage is not going to be that important. Now, obviously, we're going to have to wait and see what his weapon effects are. I don't believe Kuro has revealed those yet, and whenever we know what those are, we're going to be able to see how important it is for the teams, if it does much for his own damage, or if it's going to help the team damage. We don't know yet. But as far as I'm concerned, I believe that you're still going to be able to get a lot of value out of him, even if you don't get whatever it ends up being. So, as odd as it may seem, because you might look at a character like Qiuyuan and think, okay, he's not free-to-play friendly because he's niche for echo skill damage characters. No, he actually does end up being, like, decently free-to-play friendly when you look at it from this perspective. Not only that, but he's best in slot for Galbraina, and he's also going to be really good for Frolova, replacing Roshia as a third slot teammate for her. I would say that this does somewhat help his case in free-to-play friendliness, simply because Frolova is so broken in Whimpering Wastes. Yes, she is really SIG dependent, but that's more so for her TOA performance. In wuwa, she can get away just fine with a really cheap team and still get ridiculous scores. And Roshi is just a really niche pull in general, and is literally the lowest value limited 5-star in the game right now. It is very hard to justify pulling for Roshia. So, he can also save on you having to make an even more niche pull that basically just doesn't have any modicum of realistic value. Alternatively, he could free up your shorekeeper for another team, and that's also quite nice of him. So all around, he ends up working with two very strong DPSs, is gonna push Frolova into the meta even further because she's already really meta, it's just only gonna get better from here. And because of his nature as a second slot teammate support, he's naturally going to be pretty inherently free-to-play friendly. And this is something that I'd like to point out. I feel like with Wuthering Waves free-to-play friendly is always going to be just a little bit different from other gacha games, because you kind of have to evaluate it from a different point of view, considering that there's only 3 teammate slots, and I would say that generally speaking, they're all designed in a little bit more of a niche way. Not all characters, but a majority of them, with the one character that's not really that niche being literally the highest value pool in the game, that being Shorekeeper, because no matter how many third slot teammates we get that are on her level for specific teams, she's always going to be the universal best character for most teams, which just makes her a ridiculously high value pull. So, with that in mind, I would say that whenever you take a look at Qiuyuan from a realistic point of view, he ends up being free-to-play friendly for the respective teams that he's in, and he ends up being a good investment for the teams that he's in, especially whenever you consider that it is worth getting him over using Mortefi with Galbraina. It's not really an Augusta situation where is really good for Augusta, but you'll still feel really satisfied with using Mortefi. The thing is, a Galbraina with Mortefi Shorekeeper is gonna perform about as well as Absolution Phoebe, which isn't bad at all, and if you're satisfied with that performance, that's absolutely fine. But you're able to push her to so much more than that, especially in TOA where she thrives the best. In Frolova's case, I would say that he's less free-to-play friendly there just because Frolova herself is inherently a little bit less free-to-play friendly, wanting her signature weapon so much and whatnot. However, the rest of her team, she very much can just use Donjin as a second slot teammate if you didn't pull for Cantarella, etc, etc. She's not exactly the most free-to-play friendly DPS on the market, but she's certainly one of the more free-to-play friendly ones. And either way, yes, Qiuyuan ends up being good for her. And I will say this though, while he is niche, in a sense, and I will defend that because I don't really think he's that niche if you really think about it, I will point this out. Echo's skill damage buffing is a heck of a lot more niche than something like skill percent and glacial percent, like what Juja provides on Outro. I will not deny that what he provides and the majority of his value does still come from a pretty niche source. However, the reason why I don't really dock any points for this is because really just think about it. Basically, most second slot teammates have 1 or 2 characters that they're really good with. This is nothing unusual. What he provides is niche, sure, but he's not really locked into working with one specific character. I will say that if they never make more Echo skill damage characters, then yes, he is basically going to live and die with Frolova and Galbraina in terms of meta value. However, those 2 characters are bound to survive for a long time, so at least for now, he does actually end up being a good free-to-play friendly investment. And just so you know, back during the 2.0 days, I was saying Jojo was a really good free-to-play friendly investment, and I still stood by that statement back then, and to be honest, I think that it was a reasonable thing to say, because Jinshi was one of the best carries in the game at that time, and Carlotta was also making absolute Wuthering Waves in the meta. So whenever you consider that, I think that those 2 were very much good investments, and I thought that Jojo was then, by proxy, a good investment. And because now, Frolova and Galbraina are really good investments, Qiuyuan is a really good investment in my opinion. So, is he free-to-play friendly? I'll say that you definitely don't require him. Like, he's not one of those supports where if you don't have him, your DPSs are gonna feel a lot worse, because I will say Frolova does have other options, and you're still going to clear with her very well if you're still using Roshia or Shorekeeper as your third slot. And when it comes to Galbraina, I do honestly just advise you get Qiuyuan if you didn't pull for Lupa, or if you don't have any of the other fusion teammates. But it's definitely not as bad as, say, a negative status character. Nowhere near as bad as that. So you can pass on him if you're just not interested. If all you want to know is, can I just pass on the guy in general? Yeah, no, absolutely. You don't require him by any means. The characters that he works with do have other options that work well. However, undeniably, he is best in slot for those characters, and he does his job incredibly well. So, whenever you consider all of this, and the fact that he generally likely isn't going to end up being that expensive himself, yeah, I honestly think he is free-to-play friendly. Now, I will say, don't get him if you don't have Galbraina or Frolova. This is why I'm saying that he's a good investment for respective accounts, or if you're just interested in certain characters in general, because for those characters, he is free-to-play friendly, yes. But if you're not using him with those characters, well then you just don't really have a reason to get him. But like I said, imagine pulling for a Juja if you didn't have Carlotta, what would the point be? Or if you didn't have a Jinchi, same question, what would the point be? I'm gonna defend his nicheness because I really don't think it's that bad. It's not a negative status character, that's really all I need. All around, I think he is a great investment for free-to-plays if you like those respective characters that I talked about in this video, and he himself likely isn't gonna end up being that expensive. We can already read his kit, we know what he's gonna be all about. He's not necessarily gonna be a Brant Wuthering Waves, he's not really gonna be in a Yuno, and there's nothing in his kit that really screams, oh my goodness, you need this ridiculous stat or this weapon in order to fix this issue. So, all around, yeah, I think he's free-to-play friendly, in my personal opinion. Hopefully this video is able to tell you if Qiuyuan is free-to-play friendly or not. This has been Juice, signing out, and there's not that much long left to go to get our wuwa Yasuo.